have your please? Good evening. Hello, and welcome to this spring's Tiffany Lecture in Foreign Affairs. My name is Professor Brian McGraw. I teach in the Politics International Relations Department, and we're really glad you're here. The Tiffany Lecture is an endowed lecture that was set up to honor Orrin Tiffany, who was a college professor here at this college from 1931 to 1945. He taught in history and politics and had a particular sort of love of global politics. In fact, so much so that he was invited to be an observer at the United Nations Founding Conference in 1945. Dr. Tiffany passed away in 1950. And five years after retiring, and 2 years later, his wife established an endowed fund to bring speakers to campus who would stimulate interest in and awareness of global issues. We've had a number of very distinguished guests. Tonight, we are very honored to have Dr. William Inboden. Dr. Inboden is the Executive Director of the William P. Clements Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also an associate professor in the Emily J. School of Public Affairs and a distinguished scholar at the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Prior to his academic appointments, he worked during the Bush administration for the National Security Council and on the policy planning staff at the State Department. He has also served on staffs in Congress for a number of senators, as we heard stories about at dinner. Tonight, he'll be giving a lecture entitled The Middle East's Four Conflicts and the Challenges of Christian Statecraft. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Inboden.
Thank you very much, Professor McGraw, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. I especially appreciate all of you here tonight, as I understand we have some very stiff competition from Shark Tank. So a special measure of blessing on all of you who decided to come here. I don't know if it'll be as entertaining, but I hope it'll be at least somewhat edifying. This is somewhere here in early, it's my first time back at Wheaton since I was in graduate school, actually. I was here for part of the summer of 2001 doing some research over at the Billy Graham archives, and I regret that it's been so long since I've come back. So this has been a long overdue return visit, and a very special day of catching up with a number of old friends and making new friends. To begin my reflections tonight, I want to pivot off the theme of how a seemingly small, obscure event can trigger profound consequences, which we are still dealing with today. So for the undergraduates here tonight, please think back to where you probably were on December 17th, 2010. I would guess that most of the seniors in this room were probably putting the finishing touches on your last batch of college applications. The freshmen, sophomores, and juniors were probably just finishing up all your fall semester high school final exams or already enjoying Christmas break. The faculty were probably grading final exams. None of you could have known, just as none of the rest of us knew, that on the same day, a disgruntled 26-year-old fruit vendor in an obscure pocket of North Africa would set himself on fire to protest the confiscation of his wheelbarrow of fruit by corrupt local officials. His self-immolation launched a wave of protests across the region that soon led to the overthrow of several governments and also immolated much of the geopolitical order of the broader Middle East. The young man was Mohammed Bouazizi, the country was Tunisia, and the series of revolutions he sparked continue to unfold today into their fifth year. They were initially optimistically known as the Arab Spring. That term is not used so often anymore because spring implies optimism and hope and new possibilities. And as we'll look at tonight, instead the consequences of that have been very, very, very mixed, and we're still trying to understand them. So the old Middle Eastern order that many of us knew for a generation is, or longer even, is no more. Today's Wheaton seniors were the first students in over 30 years to enter college without Mubarak governing Egypt, without Gaddafi ruling Libya, or an Assad completely controlling Syria. Yes, some rulers have not changed. The House of Saud still runs Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah is the latest Hashemite monarch to rule Jordan, and the other Gulf monarchies are still intact. But even each of these monarchies feels a new level of insecurity, a different relationship with their citizens, and the strong buffets of regional instability. For now gone is the regional order of mostly secularist autocrats presiding over post-colonial nation states. Gone also are the strategic pillars of American foreign policy doctrine in the region really since World War II. which assumed that these autocrats, even as they themselves may have shifted, the systems remain in place, it assumed these autocrats could be relied upon to preserve stability. So in their place, what do we have now? Looking just at the daily headlines, it may seem bewildering and impossible to make sense of what is happening in the Middle East today. From Islamic State beheadings, to Iran's nuclear program, to civil war in Libya and Syria, to multiple changes of government in Egypt and Yemen, the old order may be no more, but it seems that only chaos, violence, and aggression have taken its place. The situation is so complex that in recent congressional testimony just a couple of weeks ago, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, who's our nation's top intelligence official, all the intelligence agencies and department heads report to Director Clapper, he said that, quote, unpredictable instability is the new normal. The year 2014 saw the highest rate of political instability since 1992, the most deaths as a result of state-sponsored mass killings since the early 1990s, and the highest number of refugees and internally displaced persons since World War II. Now, while Clapper's testimony was describing global conditions, the vast majority of this death and instability and IDPs emanates from the chaos of the broader Middle East. So I want to do two things in my time tonight. First, I want to try to offer a way of analyzing or understanding the current travails in the Middle East. And second, I want to pivot and speak as a Christian as well as a scholar and suggest a way for us as Christians to think broadly about the role of foreign policy in God's created order, with perhaps some specific applications to the policy conundrums of the Middle East today. And the second part of my remarks, I hope, will be of interest even for those of you who don't follow Middle East policy, but may be thinking about careers in defense or foreign policy or national security more broadly. Turning back to the Middle East, I want to say, as you picked up from my talk title, that there are 4 conflicts occurring simultaneously in the Middle East. The revolutionary and now counter-revolutionary cauldron in the region is so vexing because these multiple conflicts are occurring on multiple levels all at once. The region is being consumed by 4 contests. Each of these 4 contests has a unique dynamic of its own, but each also touches on the other, and often multiple conflicts reinforce each other and feed on each other. So while the daily headlines focus on internal tumult in places like Iraq and Syria, the deeper fault lines of these 4 conflicts crisscross the entire region in a Byzantine web, sometimes along national borders and sometimes across them, sometimes along confessional lines and sometimes in the very heart of Islamic theology. I'll walk through what I think these 4 conflicts are. The first one is the great power conflict. This is primarily between Russia and the United States. This is a conflict between 2 countries that are not Middle Eastern countries, but are playing out their tensions with each other in the Middle East. The United Kingdom, France, and China are also playing active but secondary roles in this conflict. So for the U.S., the question is, we will remain the predominant outside power within the region. So for the last, really since the 67 war, in the 73 war, the United States has been a dominant outside power in the Middle East. And Russia is now very actively challenging that. And for Russia, the question is how much Moscow can erode America's standing and increase Moscow's own influence. The war in Syria is the most visible proxy conflict, with Russia being the Assad regime's most committed and important supporter, while the United States backs the rebels attempting to overthrow him. But Egypt is also another front in this struggle, as Putin attempts to woo the Sisi government back into Russia's orbit 4 decades after Anwar Sadat, a previous long ago Egyptian ruler, expelled Soviet advisors and aligned Egypt with the United States. Egypt now gets 50% of its military hardware from Russia. This is a conscious bid on Russia's part to bring Egypt back into Russia's orbit and away from the United States. The ongoing, so the U.S.-Egypt alliance may be unraveling, and Russia is doing all that it can to hasten this. The ongoing negotiations of Iran's nuclear program also display this contest. Russia and China are part of the P5+1 negotiating team, but they're trying to play a complex game. On the one hand, they don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. They also want to keep Iran strong enough to bedevil American interests in the region. So they want to keep Iran on this leash of sorts, but a relatively long leash where Iran can still cause some mischief. So that's the first, the great power conflict. The second one is the regional power conflict. And this is the contest over which Middle Eastern nations will be the dominant power or powers in the region. For some time, the standoff has primarily been the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but now others, such as Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar, are also jockeying for position and seeking to extend their influence. And these alliances are ever shifting. At first, it appeared that the Saudis and the Qataris were aligned in their support for the Syrian rebels, the first year or two of the Syrian civil war, but then they later split over which factions to support. They also, Saudi and Qatar also divided in Egypt over whether to back the Muslim Brotherhood, which was Qatar's choice, or the military, which was Saudi Arabia's preference, and Saudi Arabia eventually won out on that one. Now, a couple of years ago, Egypt's own implosion diminished its regional influence. Egypt used to be one of the two dominant powers main dominant powers in the region. But now under General Sisi's leadership, Egypt is trying to reassert itself, and it now has a new rival with Turkey, just as Turkey under the Erdogan government is trying to also play a powerful regional role. But just as Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia may be competing with each other, they're all also united with each other in their opposition to Iran increasing as a regional power. Have I confused you yet? It is a real mess. This is a multi-dimensional chessboard. And Egypt and Turkey and Saudi aren't really being paranoid in their concerns about Iran wanting to be the dominant power of the region, because Iran probably holds its strongest hand now since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, as it controls or exerts considerable influence on Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. So 4 countries right there, and also is active in Bahrain and a number of other countries with large Shia populations. So the third conflict is the religious conflict. And this is the one between the Sunni and the Shia. This is the Sunni-Shia divide. Now, the fault lines in this contest are not nation states per se, but rather the Sunni and Shia leadership and communities across the region. A number of countries in the region have mixed Sunni and Shia populations. Iraq has mostly Shia, but has a number of Sunni. Saudi is mostly Sunni, but has a number of Shia. Bahrain is mostly Shia, but is governed by a Sunni monarchy, and so on. And so this contest between the Sunni and the Shia is sometimes coextensive with nation states, such as Iran being the primary representative of Shiism in the region, and Saudi Arabia on some days being the primary voice for the Sunnis. But the contest is ultimately transnational, and it cuts across national borders in places like Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Yemen that have both Sunni and Shia populations. This contest also helps explain why successive Shia governments in Iraq under former Prime Minister Maliki and now Prime Minister Abedi have increased their collaboration with Iran. Remember, under Saddam Hussein, Iraq and Iran were mortal enemies. They fought a very bloody 8-year war throughout the 1980s. Iran is ethnically Persian, Iraq is ethnically Arab. But now those ethnic and national identities are being somewhat subsumed by the religious solidarity between Iran's Shia and Iraq's Shia. But in turn, this contest also has its multiple sub-levels with internal rivalries, such as Shiism's own internal struggle between Ayatollah Sistani's more quietist school in Iraq and then Ayatollah Khamenei's militancy. So even the Shia leaders are differing among themselves. And there's likewise within Sunnism multiple competing claimants to the theological mantle of leadership, whether Mecca or Cairo's Al-Azhar, or even Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's proclamation of a new caliphate under the Islamic State. So just as there's the question who speaks for Shiism, there's also the question who speaks for the Sunni. And then there's the fourth conflict, the ideological conflict. And this is the contest between multiple competing visions of how to order government and society. It's the contest that will do the most to determine the future of the region. While this contest also has an irreducibly religious dimension, ultimately the debate is over what will be the dominant mode of political organization in the region. And amidst the many fractures and fissures, and I could give you 20 or 30 little subcategories of this one, we'll try to group them into 3 main worldviews and 3 main broad categories. Violent Islamism, peaceful Islamism, and then pluralism. So violent Islamism, the first one, which is a competing ideology in the region, uses force to impose a narrow politicized vision of Sharia law and brooks no dissent. Its proponents are relatively diverse. There's Shia and Sunni proponents. It would include the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and arguably the Islamic Republic of Iran. Second category are the peaceful Islamists. These are ones who renounce violence. That's what distinguishes them, of course, from violent Islamists, but still otherwise to seek to bring the political order under some sort of Islamic government or as Islamist rule and blur the distinction between mosque and state. And this camp would be most of the Muslim Brotherhood movements, the AK Party in Turkey, and the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. And then there's pluralism, which is really more of a set of commitments than a dominant ideology. It protects political and social space for a diverse array of participants, religious and secular. And even if pluralism may privilege one religion, usually in the Middle East it'll be privileging Islam, it still allows the practice of others. It still allows some space for freedom of worship for others. But pluralism is obviously dominant in a liberal democracy such as we live in, but it's also quite possible under benign autocracies and monarchies. And I think there's some governments in the region that have some commitment to pluralism. I'm hedging this carefully because we can point to all sorts of human rights violations and intolerances of some of these. But these would include Jordan, Egypt on a good day, Qatar on a good day, the United Arab Emirates, and Tunisia. And so overall, this ideological contest is really taking place within different expressions of Islam: violent Islamism, peaceful Islamism, and Islamic pluralism, if you will. But as is too often forgotten, but has been in the news quite a bit lately, not everyone in the Middle East is Muslim. And there are a number of non-Muslim religious minorities there, especially some of the historic Christian communities. And so non-Muslims, especially Christians and other religious minorities, are also active participants in this debate, and they really have an existential stake in its outcome, as they would not fare very well under the violent Islamist or the peaceful Islamist movements. Now, making the situation even more complicated, as I just walked through what I think are the four contests going on there, these four conflicts are not discrete and exclusive, but they're taking place simultaneously. They often shape each other and feed on each other. And so just as I'm trying to impose a little bit of analytic clarity on this real mess, it's not like they can be hermetically sealed into four different buckets. We just treat each one, particularly for the policymaker, you can't treat them as autonomous. So the regional power contest with Iran that I mentioned earlier and its efforts at greater influence is overlaid on the Sunni-Shia conflict. The struggle between Islamism and pluralism plays out amidst the civil wars in Syria and Libya. The great power contest between the United States and Russia finds both nations are also united in concern of the Islamic State. And so understanding the tumult in the region as these four contests may, if you buy my model, help bring a measure of analytical clarity, but it doesn't necessarily dictate what American policy should be. And so for any aspiring policymakers in the room, I'm only getting you halfway there. Then there's this. I've talked in somewhat dispassionate tones here. I'm trying to be analytical and tell you what I think is going on in the region. The chaos in the Middle East is also a human tragedy. As the testimony from Director Clapper that I quoted earlier points out, these contests are occurring against and often causing tremendous suffering and injustice. In Syria alone, over 200,000 have been killed, the vast majority of them civilians, and many of them women and children. It really approaches the scale of genocide. The savagery and bloodlust of the Islamic State, as you've seen it on TV, it's been most visible in the beheadings and even the immolations of its captives. But it also includes crucifixions, rape, enslavement, and a particular viciousness towards religious minorities such as Christians and Yazidis. Iran's nuclear program gets all the headlines, especially in the last few weeks, but Iran also happens to be one of the most repressive regimes in the world, especially if you're a religious minority, a dissident, many women. And then even ostensibly stable American allies, such as Saudi Arabia, are actually places of horrible repression, where women and religious minorities have few rights, where human trafficking and virtual enslavement of guest workers is all too common. I'll just deviate from my notes for a second here, offer a personal reflection on this. When I worked for the government, I had multiple occasions to travel to Saudi Arabia, and as a Christian, I wanted to see what conditions were like for Christians there. And so I arranged with a Christian friend who worked at the U.S. Embassy. I said, I know there's not a single church building in this whole country because Saudi Arabia is an Islamic theocracy, does not allow any non-Muslim houses of worship. But I also knew that there are hundreds of thousands of professing Christians there, whether they're Filipino guest workers or American petroleum executives. And so I said, where do they worship? And so my friend said, well, I want you to meet me at midnight in this particular hotel lobby. And I said, okay. So I show up in the lobby at midnight, and we get in his car, and we drive about a half hour around Riyadh on this aimless path, and then we pull up on a blind corner, and we get out, and we get in another car, and we drive another half hour or so, and it's now about 1 a.m. We want to make sure we weren't being followed. And then he takes us to this back alley, and we walk down a couple steps, and we go in this sub-level basement of this apartment building. and walk into the basement, and I go into a room probably about the quarter size of this room, and there's just 2 or 3 people in the room, and it's lined the walls are lined floor to ceiling with about 12-inch thick mattresses. Why are all these mattresses up here? He says, well, it's to soundproof it. And then over the next half hour, every 2 or 3 minutes right on schedule, these Filipino Christians would show up. They'd come 1 or 2 at a time, because if a whole group shows up, it would tip off the authorities. And by about 1:45 or so, we had a critical mass of about 80 Filipinos and me and this guy from the embassy squeezed into this room about the size of your dorm. And then we had this very moving, very loud worship service for about an hour. And then that ends about 2:30. And then over the next 45 minutes, every 2 or 3 minutes, 2 of us would leave, because again, you can't leave en masse. And I got back to my hotel about 4 in the morning, and then everyone, all the Filipinos had to be at their different jobs by 5 or 6 in the morning. And so that's how Christians worship in Saudi Arabia. And if you're caught doing that, if you're lucky, you'll just get a number of lashes and be in prison for a few years. If you're unlucky, you'll be beheaded. This is an American ally. There's actually good reasons why it's an American ally that I'll get to. But let's not kid ourselves about what a repressive place it is. And so it's on this point of injustice and suffering that I want to turn to the question of a Christian view of statecraft. It's often these moral concerns that seize the conscience and capture the attention of Christians in the United States and throughout the rest of the world. You can see I'm seized by this. I mean, if you're not, you should you should ask yourself some very hard questions. When we see Coptic Christians being beheaded, as 17 of them were on the beach on the Mediterranean just a few weeks ago. When we see other Christians being imprisoned or tortured or murdered only because of their faith. When we see women and children of any faith being enslaved by the Islamic State. When we see over 1 million refugees being displaced by the Syrian civil war. When we see children being trafficked into forced labor in wealthy Gulf monarchies, our hearts should be stirred. And we often want our government, those of us who are Americans, to take action in response. We're often right to do so. And in part, the history of American Christians becoming involved in foreign policy emanates from these irreducibly moral concerns. Just over the last couple of decades, we've seen this upsurge in evangelical Christian involvement in American foreign policy, and it's often been around these moral issues, whether religious persecution, trafficking in persons, human rights in North Korea, genocide in Sudan, HIV/AIDS relief in Africa, international poverty relief and development, refugee assistance. All these issues of injustice have inspired massive and often very successful campaigns by American Christians to raise public awareness and to shape policy, to pass legislation, to get the State Department or the White House to do more on this. I would imagine that many of you here in this room share these concerns and may have been or are involved in these efforts. And again, on an autobiographical note, this is what first drew me to work in foreign policy. In 1993, I interned for U.S. Senator Dan Coates, hopefully known to many of you here as a Wheaton alum, and helped with several projects for him on behalf of persecuted Christians overseas. Before that, I didn't have an interest in a foreign policy career. I love this. This is what I want to do. And so after that, after I graduated, then worked in Washington for about a decade, as Brian mentioned earlier. But it's those humanitarian, these moral issues, religious persecution that drew me to that. And I continue to work on those issues now as a scholar and an occasional advisor to policymakers. So reducing oppression and suffering, promoting human dignity and liberty, these are values that are near to the heart of the just God that we serve. And so I think when we talk about Christians being involved in these kind of issues, Christians being concerned about the suffering and injustice in the Middle East, it's a largely admirable story. And on balance, I think these distinctive moral concerns are a positive contribution that Christians can make to American foreign policy. But my experience as a policymaker, my reading of history, and my continuing reflection on the biblical witness have also brought me a cautionary note and somewhat evolved perspective on foreign policy. And it's this: if we think of foreign policy only in moral terms, or even moralistic ones sometimes, that obscures much of the work and purpose of statecraft. Statecraft being a term of art for the conduct of diplomacy, the conduct of foreign and defense policy. So in this sense, the work of foreign policy and the maintenance of the international system, I think, might be considered a contemporary version of the Genesis creation mandate to cultivate the garden. In this case, it's to cultivate the international system. I think there's also a New Testament mandate for these purposes. So Paul's admonition in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that Christians should pray for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life. I think that suggests that there's at least an implicit connection between one calling of government, which is the preservation of order, and then the blessings known by citizens of peaceful and quiet lives. And this principle applies to international relations as well. Just as a functioning governing authority enables citizens within a nation to live in relative tranquility, whether it's things like the garbage being picked up or people knowing to stop on a red light and go on a green light, things like that we just take for granted as part of effective governance here. That's what maintains some of the order on these very nice, clean, idyllic streets of Wheaton, Illinois. So the preservation of order in the international system, I think, provides a similar benefit. So citizens of nations such as the United States or Canada or Australia and other countries that are similarly situated with peaceful borders and few external threats, we daily enjoy the peaceful and quiet lives that Paul wants us to pray for our ruling authorities for. And we enjoy these peaceful and quiet lives in ways that the citizens of Syria and Yemen and much of the Middle East right now do not. And most of the daily work of foreign and defense policy involves the regular management and implementation of policies and systems to preserve order, to maintain stable borders, to manage alliances, to protect the international flows of trade and communications. And this is the kind of statecraft, often unseen, that enables the vast majority of American citizens to go about our daily lives rarely worrying or even thinking about foreign policy, except for when you see it on the TV. Given the American predominance in the international system over the last 70 years, really, this is also the kind of work that produces considerable benefits for the citizens of other countries as well. The flaws and fragilities of the nation-state system are abundant, and yet the fact remains that it's been a system that's been conducive to stable and peaceful and prosperous lives for hundreds of millions of people around the globe. And so perhaps much of the work of international statecraft today might be considered analogous to the work of plumbers or carpenters. These tradecrafts involve the building and the maintenance of structures and systems vital to daily human existence. Sturdy houses and functioning toilets, the types of things we take for granted, until they're taken away from us, so they fail to work. And then we call the plumber, or we call the carpenter, unless we're handy enough to fix it ourselves. Well, let's extend this metaphor to international statecraft. Which often consists of the maintenance and preservation of the metaphorical scaffolding, the framework, the plumbing of the international system. The fruits of the statecraft are also the matters of daily life that we implicitly take for granted. Let me give you some examples. The fact that Americans don't really need to fear a land invasion by an outside power. That's a daily threat for some people around the world. It just isn't for us. That's not an accident. The recognition of American passports when we travel. The convertibility of the dollar into other currencies, the security of global shipping carrying resources and goods to and from American shores, the resolution of trade disputes through negotiations at the World Trade Organization rather than through tanks rolling across borders. Used to be if you have a trade dispute, you send it to the army. Now we negotiate these things. These realities are the results of statecraft. They're the results of foreign and defense policy, even if they don't stem from heroic moral campaigns. There wasn't people marching in the street to create a WTO, but it does provide some of these basic goods. And the benefits of these flow to Christians and non-Christians alike, to American citizens and citizens across the world. Just as in God's creation, as we know from the Sermon on the Mount, He makes His sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So turning back to the Middle East, what's this mean for the chaos enveloping the region and the question of American statecraft today? Now, this particular lecture doesn't afford the time or context to offer a series of policy prescriptions on here's what we should do with arming the Syrian rebels or not, or here's how we need a negotiated settlement with Iran. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. I've written elsewhere on those things. I do have some thoughts on that. But I'm trying to provide a conceptual framework for how we even think about this stuff, how do we even approach these problems and challenges. But let me also say this. Don't mistake my praise of order and my caution against excessive moralism as nostalgia for the old days of dictatorships controlling the Middle East. Dictatorships are not only unjust, they're often destabilizing. To see the brittleness and instability of dictatorship, look only at how quickly the resentful and oppressed citizens of Libya, Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen turned against their overlords. Or look at the terrorism and sectarian violence being exported by Iran to see how dictatorships can destabilize the region. As then Secretary of State was Condoleezza Rice, my boss at the time, as she stated in Cairo in 2005, For 60 years, my country, the United States, pursued stability at the expense of democracy in this region here in the Middle East, and we achieved neither. So while I don't think we should pine for the return to dictatorship, we should understand that the afflictions and oppressions besetting the Middle East emanate from the breakdown of order. Returning to my architectural metaphor, it's as if the entire framework of the region has burned down, and the arsonists, such as the Islamic State or Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei, are sitting amidst the embers, torches at the ready to wreak more havoc. So I think the calling of statecraft is to first eliminate the ability of the arsonists to cause any more destruction, and then to try to restore a semblance of order. In some circumstances, this may well mean the use of force, either directly or through arming proxies. In most others, though, it's going to entail creative, vigorous, and patient diplomacy, often backed by the threat of force. In all cases, I think it entails a chastened and a modest set of expectations for just how much American policy can accomplish. However, humility does not equal passivity. Our own history and our current preponderance in the international system, I think, should still inspire a confidence that American policy can accomplish more than has been done in recent years. And it's through first beginning to restore order that I think that will then create a context that we can pursue much more productively, remedying a lot of these humanitarian and moral abominations that so grip us. So any serious discussion of theologically informed views on international relations, at least in my world, inevitably turns to Reinhold Niebuhr, a figure I know will be familiar to some of you here, hopefully is familiar to all of you. And this is for a good reason. Over 4 decades after his death, over 7 decades after his heyday, Niebuhr, I think, still remains the most insightful and influential Christian thinker on foreign policy in the modern era, until Mark Amstutz wrote his recent book. So, shout out to Professor Amstutz there. Among Niebuhr's many salient insights is the relationship between order and justice in a fallen world plagued by original sin. As he observed in one of his classic books, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, let me quote from Niebuhr here, "Order precedes justice in the strategy of government, but only an order that implicates justice can achieve a stable peace." So Niebuhr thus privileged maintaining order as the most fundamental task of government. He did not deny or even overlook the ambition for justice. Rather, it's only possible after basic order is established and maintained that I think the possibility of ideals like justice and liberty can be approached or attained. So foreign policy at its most fundamental level must first create and preserve international order. Foreign policy at its most aspirational level can then promote justice and liberty. Thank you very much. I know I tossed out a lot of provocations, so Professor McGraw, rescue me.
So we have plenty of time for question and answer. So please, I think Dr. Inboden will field questions, whatever you might have to ask. Yes.
I ask this out of ignorance and not knowing, but where is ISIS's playing ground, and what kind of impact is that having on these 4 types of conflicts that you described?
Yeah, well, okay, great question. I'll repeat it for everyone. The question is about ISIS's, the Islamic State's playing ground and what impact it's having on these four crises. It's really at the heart of these crises. We can actually, in some ways, see it in each of the 4. The main one, of course, is the ideological context, because ISIS is putting forward, however barbaric and perverse, a very coherent and, to some people, compelling vision of here's what we think the region should look like. It should be an Islamic caliphate governed by their particular interpretation of a very rigid and vicious form of Sunni Sharia law. But we also see this playing out in the Sunni-Shia divide, because ISIS sees the Shia as one of their arch enemies, and they've been especially vicious in attacking Shia, particularly Shia parts of Iraq. And so that's why you see Iranian Shia militias and Iraqi Shia army units fighting against ISIS, because they see it not just as a national war, but as a Sunni-Shia contest. But meanwhile, it's also playing into the regional contest as Turkey and Iran and Saudi and Egypt all try to figure out which side of ISIS they're going to be on and who can play a role in containing or rolling back ISIS. And then, of course, it plays out the great power contest because about the only thing the United States and Russia agree on in the region is they don't like ISIS. So that's about the one thing that's been bringing, arguably a couple of other things, bringing them together. But as I mentioned earlier, I'll just repeat this for some of you who weren't here for our earlier discussion. The Islamic State is a, think of it as jihadism 3.0, if you will. It's got some new distinguishing marks that make it especially troubling, especially dangerous. First, that they control territory now. We haven't seen militant jihadist groups actually control territory as effective sovereigns before. Second, that they have their own revenue sources through kidnappings, through oil smuggling, through extortion, through exacting tribute, through slave trading. It's perverse, it's vicious, it's appalling, and it's making them rich in a way they don't have to rely on the patronage of renegade sheikhs like Al-Qaeda did. Third is that they've actually set up this caliphate. First time we've seen a jihadist group set up a caliphate, and that is sending a signal throughout the region that, hey, if you want to be on the winning side of Islam, join the Islamic State because we have set up this caliphate. And that's why we're seeing other jihadist groups who previously had been either independent or more aligned with Al-Qaeda, such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a number of the jihadist groups in Libya, Boko Haram more recently, start to declare allegiance of some sort to the Islamic State. And then the fourth very disturbing characteristic is a lot of the Islamic State fighters have Western passports. And so even their locus of activity right now is the Iraq-Syria region. They have a transnational reach and are drawing people in from the United States and Europe, and in turn are able to send them back. So, and ISIS really emanated from this larger breakdown in order. It's partly they took advantage of the vacuum created by the Syrian civil war. They took advantage of failed governance and the sectarian tensions in Iraq. And so when Syria and Iraq are no longer able to be effective governance and preserve order in the region, in steps the Islamic State to take advantage of that vacuum. Yes, right here.
How does a country promote order while also promoting freedom when most governments that are freely elected in the Middle East tend to be anti-U.S.?
Yeah, very, very good question. I'll repeat it. How does a country promote order and also promote freedom? It's not easy, and there is not a one-size-fits-all recipe for this. Sometimes it's a matter of sequencing. Other times it's going to be a matter of using different diplomatic tools. But I'll give a couple of examples from the Cold War and then actually apply them more and more today. So. I'm giving a talk later this week on Reagan administration's democracy policy, so I have to write it tomorrow, so maybe I can try it on you tonight first, right? So the misunderstood aspect of the Reagan administration's democracy policy in the Cold War is they pursued a dual-track democracy and human rights policy. Against communist countries that were seen as our adversaries, the Reagan administration was very active in supporting dissidents there, providing funding for them, even providing Bibles to house churches behind the Iron Curtain, letting a number of persecuted Soviet Christians hide out in the U.S. Embassy for several years. Every time Reagan or Secretary Shultz would meet with their Soviet counterpart to negotiate nuclear missiles, they'd first give a list of religious prisoners they want and human rights dissidents they wanted to see released. Jews, Christians, political dissidents, things like this. And they also spoke out a lot against this. One of his greatest speeches was his June 1982 speech to the British Parliament, saying that communism will end up on the ash heap of history. Within that, he announced the creation of what became the National Endowment for Democracy. So the Reagan administration pursued a very confrontational policy of supporting freedom movements in repressive countries that were our adversaries. But the Reagan administration also, and they get dinged for this hypocrisy sometimes, they also supported a number of right-wing dictatorships. The Marcos government in the Philippines, the military dictatorship in South Korea, military dictatorship in Taiwan, a number in Latin America. And what they were doing there, the defense of it, if you believe in it's defensible, is twofold. One, they said we need these people to help us defeat the greater foe of communism. And the most effective way to bring more freedom to the world is not just supporting human rights dissidents in the Soviet Union, it's ending communism. So the end of the Cold War is what really brought a great advance in democracy in Eastern Europe. But here's the other thing that I think the Reagan administration is less understood about. While they allied with and supported these right-wing, pretty repressive dictatorships, they were also pushing them to democratize and to allow more freedom for their people. So it's kind of a suffocating embrace. So, hey, South Korea, we're going to provide you, military aid and economic aid, and we're going to ally with you, and we're going to hug you really tight. By the way, let those dissidents out of jail and open up. And so that's why we saw South Korea democratize in 1987, Taiwan democratized around the same time, the Philippines democratized in 1986. El Salvador get on a path to democratization. And so it's possible to ally with a country because of this need to have them on your side to preserve order, if you will, and defeat a larger foe. Look, we did this in World War II. I mean, who's the second greatest butcher of the 20th century? Joseph Stalin. Who was, next to Churchill, our most important ally in World War II? Joseph Stalin. Why? Because we were fighting Hitler, and we needed the Soviets on our side to defeat the Nazis. Doesn't mean we turned a blind eye to Stalin's repressions, the tens of millions killed by him. But in a fallen world, sometimes you need to make these short-term compromises for a longer-term goal. So what does this mean for today? Well, go back to my example of Saudi Arabia and those house churches I shared with you. Saudi Arabia is a very important American ally. There's been several terrorist plots directed against the United States that would have hit us, would have killed a lot of Americans if it weren't for Saudi intelligence helping intercept it. That's just a fact. Americans are alive today who otherwise would have been killed because of our partnership with Saudi Arabia. Very important for basing rights and some other sensitive issues in the region. But they're also this brutal, thuggish regime. We haven't persuaded the Saudis to start respecting religious freedom yet, but one thing we did after I came back from that trip looking into the conditions of religious oppression and persecution there is the Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was a great boss to work for. I and others made the recommendation to him, let's put Saudi Arabia on our designation list of the worst violators of religious freedom in the world. At the time, it was Iran, North Korea, Sudan, China, some pretty thuggish regimes. We're usually not used to putting our allies on that list, but we did with the Saudis. We put them on the list. President Bush made the call to do it. He then called King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia and said, you're not going to like this, but we've tried quietly with you for a couple of years to get you to at least allow those poor Filipinos to worship in peace. How wrong is that? That's not going to overthrow the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And so that policy continued for a while. We saw some gradual improvements from the Saudis. It didn't end our alliance with them, but we were able to nudge them along in reform. Egypt's another example. That speech I quoted from Condi Rice in 2005. She had canceled an earlier trip to Egypt that same year because Egypt had imprisoned Ayman Noor, leading political dissident. He was critical of the Mubarak government. Egypt's a very important ally of ours. At the time, we were giving them $2 billion a year in economic and military assistance. They were not used to American governments doing these kind of things, but she canceled her trip to Egypt. Huge humiliation for the Egyptians because they had imprisoned Ayman Noor. So it's possible to maintain a diplomatic partnership with a government and not turn a blind eye to its repression, and even look for ways. Sometimes you have more influence with friends than you do with adversaries. Now, I gave you a couple of examples how it may have seemed to work, but look, Egypt is still an unstable and closed and autocratic place. The Sisi government they're cracking down on militant jihadists. They're also cracking down on peaceful dissidents. They're not treating Coptic Christians too well either. It's not a good government. And I would like to see American policy today find a way to maintain the partnership with Egypt because we need them for this regional stability while still having an active and vigorous dialogue with them about opening up and reforming. So it's not an easy recipe at all, but I think these things can be done. Too often, even our most sophisticated diplomats will tell you it's twice, well, we either ally with the Saudis and work with them, or else we act like moralistic scolds and tell them they need to let those poor Filipinos worship, and that'll rupture the alliance. The Saudis are in it for their own interests too. They need the United States as much as we need them. And they can put up with a little bit of American heckling on the need to promote some of these reforms. One more thing too, these things are often tied together. It's often forgotten that 15 out of the 19 September 11th hijackers were natives of what country? Saudi Arabia, that's right. Why? Well, it's no coincidence they'd grown up on this diet of very intolerant, extremist Wahhabi Sunni ideology and made them much more susceptible to radicalization. And for the first year and a half or so after 9/11, we were having a little bit of a hard time getting the Saudis to get the message. They were somewhat in denial about it. One more anecdote, how these things all come together. I was originally supposed to take that trip to Riyadh in early May 2003 for a number of sensitive issues we were going to be talking to the Saudis about. And 2 days before I was supposed to get on the plane, we got a warning from our CIA station there saying, don't come. We're getting, the terrorist threat warnings are off the charts. Something bad's going to happen here. And so we canceled our trip. But 2 days later, the CIA got this one right. Al-Qaeda attacked a couple of Western residential compounds, killed about 40 or 50 people. That was Saudi Arabia's 9/11. And that finally got their attention that they had been feeding a dragon in their own backyard. That the Al-Qaeda threat was not just out there, it was now here. And that this intolerant Sunni extremist ideology that they were cultivating was really becoming a threat to the regime at home. Didn't turn them into Mennonite pacifists overnight, believe me, far from it. However, it got them to realize that they can't have their cake and eat it too, that they needed to moderate a little bit. And that made them more open to talking to us about allowing some more space for the Christians and the Hindus and others to worship there as well. So they still have a ways to go, but these things are connected. Yes, right here.
Could you make any comments at all on the Boko Haram in Nigeria, and is it significant, insignificant in connection with the Middle East?
The question about Boko Haram in Nigeria and whether it's significant or not in connection with the Middle East. I'll give a typical professor answer, complicated and too soon to tell. Now I'll try to give a little more of a clear answer. I worry it is. Earlier, Boko Haram started as more or less an indigenous movement. Nigeria is predominantly Muslim in the north and predominantly Christian in the south. Some of the Muslims in the north have become radicalized and create this group Boko Haram. And its viciousness make it in the headlines when they do the awful things like kidnap young girls. But they're now entering a whole other order of magnitude of sophistication and lethality. And they now control a pretty large pocket of northeastern Nigeria. So that is a concern, that they're actually starting to control territory. Even more of a concern is that they've now sworn allegiance to the Islamic State. Is there any substance to that? We don't know yet. I mean, I'm not read into the intel programs like I used to be, so I don't know if there's evidence of actual operational planning between ISIS and Boko Haram, or if this is more just trading jerseys, if you will. But it's a reminder that the pathologies of this jihadist ideology do transcend borders and can have a captivating appeal to other radical groups that over time could pose a threat. Of course, remember the underwear bomber was Nigerian. So another thing is, while Boko Haram's activities most have been confined to Nigeria, we've seen that sometimes some Nigerians may be radicalized by this and want to target part of the West. So watch that space carefully. It does not look good. Right here.
You referred to Khomeini and some of the other Islamist strongman dictators as arsonists, and I think few would argue with that. However, I think it's fair to say that in the past couple of decades, we ourselves have been arsonists in the Middle East. And I want to ask you, how specifically can the United States, like you said, do more in the region without being arsonists?
Good question. By arsonists, are you referring to the Iraq War?
Iraq War, 1953, with Iran.
The first general comment, well, first, I'm not going to sit here and I'd be the last one in the world as a scholar or recovering policymaker to say that every last aspect of American policy for the last 7 years in the Middle East has been constructive, positive, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that on balance, by and large, the American presence and influence in the Middle East has been done more good than harm. So I'm very, very glad to say that on balance it's been better. I would. On the 1953 coup, I'll be a little more controversial here and say the CIA's role in that is way overstated. They supported it, but they did not cause it. That was much more an indigenous one. Mossadegh had worn out his welcome. He had lost support of about 80% of the American people. CIA and British intelligence kind of capitalized on that, but he probably would have been deposed anyway. The Shah was I think a short-term foolish bet the United States made that we shouldn't have. But the Khomeini, after the '79 revolution, the new Islamic Republic realized that it's great propaganda hay because a lot of their legitimacy is based on channeling hatred towards the United States. And so the Trident Out the 53 coup is a great one to sort of blame the United States for any of their troubles. And so, look, if I was President Eisenhower, I hope I would have said, we're not going to be involved in this at all. It's not right to go around staging coups and toppling governments. But don't buy into some of the other, I think, mythology out there that says the United States was completely behind that Mossadegh was this wildly acclaimed popular leader, et cetera, et cetera. More recently, look, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been trying to figure out how can order and stability be preserved in the Middle East. You know, how, just as the Cold War is winding down, what happens? Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And the first Bush administration decides that, well, we need to roll this back because this sets a terrible precedent. If he gets Kuwait, he may also take Saudi Arabia. But then they face the problem, what do we do once we kick them out of Kuwait? Do we go all the way to Baghdad? Well, no, we're not ready for the massive post-conflict reconstruction that would involve. So let's try to box him in and contain him. Then over the next 10, 12 years, the sanctions regime was eroding. There were concerns about WMD, and so the Bush 43 administration decided that the least bad option was to take out the Saddam Hussein regime. Knowing what we know now, particularly that he did not have an active WMD program, et cetera, I don't think that was the right war to fight. And I've been on record as saying that before. I supported it at the time. I believed, as did Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and Joe Biden and British intelligence and German intelligence and French intelligence and everyone else, they had an active WMD program and we should go to war. I think we're all wrong. But let's also not, and I'm not saying you're doing this at all. Okay, I've heard this from others. You're not doing this at all. Let's not let ourselves be seduced in some sort of nostalgia for the bygone stability of the Saddam Hussein era. This is a guy who gassed his own citizens, who invaded 2 neighboring countries, who actively supported terrorism. Not only was he a morally abominable person, he was also an incredibly destabilizing presence in the region. And so, no, the United States is not the arsonist, I don't think, causing all the problems. There was not an idyllic era of peace and stability in the region from Saddam Hussein. I mean, so he himself was an arsonist. The United States just completely blew it when we invaded without any active, credible plan for post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction. So, I don't want to take the architectural metaphor too far, but we did not do our job in helping to reconstruct the edifice, even after going to war over what turned out to have not been, I think, legitimate reasons. You've been, your hand's been up there for a while. So. Sorry, Michael, right behind you. So,
we're the volleyball team, and we're going to Israel this summer for playing with the national team and doing a few mission trip opportunities. And our coach has been several times, and so she's not worried at all about it, but some of our parents are. So if you could maybe touch on that a little bit, what you think of it and what you can think going into it.
Yeah. Well, I spent some time in Israel last summer. Israel is at once one of the most, I think, besieged and battled, precarious places in the world, and also one of the safest places in the world. Israeli domestic intelligence is really, really good. And so there's a reason that they have not had many successful internal terrorist attacks in recent years. That said, I had a number of my students there a couple summers ago when Hamas started launching rockets again, and they had to be evacuated. Don't tell your parents that part. Turn off that video thing if you will. Look, it'd be reckless of me to try to make any prognoses about how safe and stable or not Israel will be. There's so much ferment going on there right now. We don't even know who won the election yet, right? Okay, yeah. See, we don't even know who the prime minister is going to be, let alone what the status of the Iran nuclear deal might be, et cetera, et cetera. But that said, I do think the U.S.-Israel relationship is an important one. I think it goes beyond government to government. I think these sort of student exchanges are really, really meaningful. And I certainly felt very safe when I was there. So have a fun trip.
Thank you.
And then behind you, there was another hand. Yes, up there at the back.
I found it interesting that in the conversation about the conflicts in the Middle East, you didn't mention Israel and Palestine at all. And I'm wondering to what extent, particularly U.S. support for Israel, has influenced the region and all 4 of those conflicts.
Yeah, so great question. And that was partly by design. I was thinking about that in terms of this is a big issue I've studied a bit and given a lot of thought to and spent some time on last summer. when I say it's by design, it's not to say that that's not a significant, important issue at all, but rather that issue predates the Arab Spring revolutions. That issue has been, as it's evolved, it's been a more or less constant one for a number of decades right now. And I am, in the near term, I'm not very pessimistic about a positive resolution. On the Israeli side, Israel is feeling very insecure right now. They know that their relationship with the United States is quite frayed. It's not very stable and strong. They are feeling threatened by Iran, and they don't feel like they have a credible negotiating partner in the Palestinian Authority. A lot of them now see their withdrawal from Gaza as perhaps a failure because they hoped that it would become self-governing, and instead Hamas took over. And so when Israel is feeling insecure, Israel is not willing to make any compromises for peace. And that's a bad state to be in. Likewise, for the Palestinians, I can't speak for all of them, but spent some time in the West Bank last summer, and I think they are feeling ignored and neglected by the rest of the region. If you like, a lot of the Arab Spring revolutions have passed them by. They used to be able to count on other Arab states to be applying pressure on Israel. It's no longer the case. The great Saudi peace plan of, I think, 2004, no one talks about that anymore. So I think the Palestinians are feeling somewhat stranded and neglected, and trying to figure out who are our friends. They also, of course, have the problem who speaks for them. Mahmoud Abbas is still ostensibly in charge in the West Bank, but then he is trying to forge some sort of agreement with Hamas where the Gaza will now come under Palestinian Authority control, and that's also a tough spot. I do think that if the United States hadn't been supporting Israel, that Israel would probably not exist today. It's a hard kind of factual, but I think there's very good evidence about that. At the same time, sometimes American support for Israel has been perhaps so unconditional that Israel has gotten away with pretty irresponsible behavior that's not been conducive to being a credible partner for peace. I do think it's one of those paradoxes that the way to encourage the Israelis to make the compromises for peace that they need, whether it's curtailing settlements or being more supportive of Palestinian economic development, etc., is when Israel feels like it's got a closer relationship with the United States. That actually gives us more leverage. Now, so we need to restore that relationship, then we need to use that leverage. And likewise, I think Secretary Kerry made a mistake when he focused so much on high-level diplomacy, trying to come up with yet another grand bargain. I think what the Palestinians need right now is just state building and economic development, and improving their lives from the ground up. And then once, whether better governance institutions or economic development is taking place for the Palestinians, maybe the Wheaton volleyball team plays a few games with Palestinian teams too. Who knows? So keep me posted on that. Then that will equip the Palestinians to perhaps be a better negotiating partner for the Israelis, and in turn, more progress can be made there. But it is a hard issue. It's just one that in some ways is kind of being passed by the other tumult in the region. But it won't go away, and we're going to have to come back to it. Professor McCoy.
So in a recent statement, Ben Rhodes, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, so people were criticizing U.S. policy in Libya, and he said, well, if U.S. had intervened in Libya, it would be Syria right now. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, what do you think was worse policy, U.S. intervention in Libya or non-intervention in Syria?
Yeah, great question. This
also goes like 91.
Yeah, so this also goes back to the Iraq one. All right, so we now have three bad examples, three political scientists out there. It's not a large N data set, but it's three bad examples. Iraq, where the United States goes in, decapitates the regime, but doesn't have a active stabilization reconstruction plan in place, degenerates into civil war and chaos. Bad example. Then we've got Libya. What's the Obama administration do? Frankly, they make the same mistake. They go in, they decapitate the regime, and they don't have an active post-conflict stabilization reconstruction plan in place. And Libya is a real mess right now. Then another example is Syria. What happens in Syria? The United States does nothing. And part of the thinking was, well, when we intervened in Iraq, it produces sectarian violence and radicalization and local resentment and humanitarian crisis and civil war, and we're not going to make that mistake. And so we stay out of Syria, and what do we get? Humanitarian crisis, civil war, sectarian strife, radicalization, the same list of pathologies. So it's kind of you know, if you remember nothing else from this evening, remember this: policy making is not choosing between a good option and a bad option. Policy making is choosing between a bad option and a really bad option, or a bad option, a really bad option, and a really, really bad option. And that's what we've had with these different circumstances and situations. I supported the Libya intervention at the time. I was actually publicly on that, trying to get more Republicans to support it as well. But I did it thinking and hoping that the Obama administration would have a better post-conflict stabilization plan to put in place, because you do have some responsibility if you decapitate a regime to provide for that. Because Libya is in the near term looks really bad. It's essentially got two competing terrorist groups controlling competing for control right now, and the Islamic State is getting allegiance from one of them. But Syria is also really bad. So yes, over here.
What's your take on the stability of the Gulf monarchies? Do you see potentially another Arab Spring type revolution occurring there, and what would the consequences of that be for the region?
Great question. The question is about the stability of the Gulf monarchies, and do I see another Arab Spring? First of all, I'm a lousy prognosticator, so don't ask me for help with your March Madness brackets, and don't ask me to predict the geopolitical future. That said, why not? I lived in Dubai for a year, a few years ago, and was able to observe the Gulf monarchy system up close. I think they're pretty stable. They had a window of instability 2011 or so when the Arab Spring was the Arab Spring. The United Arab Emirates had a number of dissenters coming up. Kuwait did, Bahrain really did. But the Gulf monarchies have figured out a formula that kind of works in the near term, which is autocratic control. These are not democracies, but allowing some more space for freedom of expression, not political parties or things like that. But okay, for example, I told you what we did for church in Riyadh. What did we do for church in Dubai? Well, we went to our church building. How did we get the church building? Sheikh Mohammed gave it to us. Why did Sheikh Mohammed give it to us? Because I was part of an American investment firm working there, and he knows that it's good for their economy to have Americans working there. And so he gave us a plot of land to build a church building. And then what happened when we Protestant evangelicals got our church building? Well, the Catholics wanted one. And so what happens when the Catholics wanted one? The Hindus wanted a temple. And so outside of Dubai, there's this several acres of all these non-Muslim houses of worship. It's like the religion bazaar. It's really but it works in terms of it helps. This promotes some of the pluralism I was talking about. It alleviates some of the social tensions that might be building up otherwise. Likewise, they have a couple of somewhat independent newspapers. I say somewhat independent in terms of they're not censored every day by the government. They can say what they want, as long as they don't criticize the government. Now, all of you know, well, that's not real freedom of speech. Of course it's not real freedom of speech. I know that, but it's a lot more than you'll get in Pyongyang or Tehran or other places like that. So that's part of the recipe the Gulf monarchies have figured out. What's the other part of the recipe they've figured out? Money. Keep pumping the oil, keep providing cradle-to-grave welfare, keep the people fat and happy, keep building these incredibly luxurious shopping malls, et cetera, et cetera. And so that model of throwing a lot of money at the people and then allowing some semblance of political and religious pluralism seems to have bought them some near-term stability. How long will it continue? I don't know. But it's a slightly more successful model than some of these other more repressive dictatorships that also don't have the advantage of a lot of oil money. Yes, Professor Iglesias. This is a prosecutor, so I'm really on it now. So guilty.
This is not a cross-examination, but another question for some prognostication on your part.
Okay.
Turkey. Where do you see Turkey going? It seems to me that when the Ataturk changed the country back in the 1920s, it was the idea of looking toward the West, looking toward democracy, creating a mosque-state separation. And it seems in recent years those changes have eroded. I'm wondering, do you believe Turkey is at risk for backsliding, for lack of a better word, or do you think this is just a momentary veer to the right?
Yeah. So the question is on the future of Turkey, particularly with this growing Islamization movement. So in 2009, I wrote a short article for Foreign Policy magazine talking about some countries that I thought were pretty unstable and might see a change in government. One I mentioned was Egypt. Actually, kind of got that one right. The other one I mentioned was Turkey. I got that one completely wrong. Again, you don't want me filling out your March Madness bracket. But the trends that worried me about Turkey back then have continued, which is that you formerly had this repressive secularism, this weird model developed by Kemal Ataturk, which essentially allowed no public expression of Islam in this almost 100% Muslim country, and had it largely ruled by the military. And as Turkey has democratized, there was a nice few years there where Turkey, as a NATO member, as a relatively progressive, educated, Western-looking Islamic country, seemed to have figured out the model of Islamic pluralism. But the Erdogan government and his AK party have been moving in a much more aggressively Islamist direction. And I worry about it. I worry that it's marking the end of Turkish democracy. I think Turkey has the largest number of imprisoned journalists of any country in the world. At least it did as of a year ago. That's not a happy place to be. And then for as different as the Bush and Obama administrations were, they both managed to screw up relations with Turkey. All right, so the Bush administration screwed up relations with Turkey over the Iraq War when we weren't able to use Turkey to base the northern invasion route through. And then the Obama administration has had severely frayed relations with Turkey over Syria, because Turkey sees Syria as this house on fire, literal house on fire next door. They're very threatened by the Islamic State. They also want the Assad regime to go, and they see the United States being too passive and hands off. That's why Turkey won't allow us basing rights for bombing the Islamic State, because they said, you guys aren't in this. You're not in the fight all the way. You're not going to see Assad gone. We don't trust the United States. We're going to go our own way. So you've got growing repression at home, alienation from the U.S. abroad, and then Turkey stealing its oats as it's trying to compete with Egypt and Saudi to be the leading Sunni power of the region. So, and this is one of our NATO treaty allies. So I'm very worried about Turkey, but I've got my past prognostications wrong. So, yes, up here.
I'm not a student of foreign policy. I'm an alum who studies theology and listens to the news. So my question is, to what extent is the United States' own identity crisis and very rapid cultural change and attempts to encourage diversity while maintaining an identity, how does that identity crisis affect our ability to act on the world stage? You mentioned particularly earlier the difficulty in coming up with an anti-radicalization program when we're trying to experiment with the limits of toleration in our own society. You see the problem?
Yeah. Boy, this is a big question. All right. If anyone's looking for a dissertation topic out there, I've got one for you right here. So, well, first, let me say a couple comments why I'm still largely bullish on America. As much as the American image is not doing so well in the Middle East under the Obama administration, just as it did very poorly in the Middle East under the Bush administration. The people of the region still look to American society and American culture in a lot of favorable ways. Yeah, they don't like our materialism and a lot of the filth spewed out by Hollywood and things like that. But they also do see the United States as a place of opportunity, as a largely religious society that has genuine religious pluralism where people of different faiths can flourish and have their freedoms respected. And that particular soft power, if you will, does have some resonance over there. So it's one of the paradoxes that, and I'm only slightly exaggerating here, when you look at these Gallup World Poll or Pew Global Public Opinion surveys, across the Middle East, that's, so which country do you dislike the most and have the strongest hostility to? It's usually the United States or Israel, all right? Then if you could move anywhere else in the world, where do you want to live? United States. And that's capturing schizophrenia, if you will. I think both those opinions are genuinely held. And but that last one should give us some hope that for all of our introspection and divisions here at home, there still is something resonant about the American model abroad. And likewise, for all of our divisions at home where we're figuring out what our foreign policy is, look, it's a good thing that Americans are engaged on this. I'm encouraged that so many students wanted to skip Shark Tank tonight and come talk to some professor from Texas about the Middle East. There's fierce debates going on right now over U.S.-Iran policy, right? These 47 senators wrote this open letter, it's very controversial. Congress invites Netanyahu to speak without consulting the White House. These are big divisions, but we're all talking about it, we're all thinking about it, and eventually whatever policy comes out of this very messy, fractious process, I think and hope will have more credibility and coherence because most Americans are somewhat behind it and had a chance for their voices to be heard. So anyway, I know I'm not giving enough of an answer for you there, but those are a couple things that give me a little bit of optimism. Yes, right here.
Returning to kind of a policy-related question, maybe has something to do with how we relate to a country like Turkey, where we're maybe optimistic sometimes about pursuing a friendlier relationship, but there's how do we relate to the Kurds? There's sort of a quasi-state in northern Iraq that seems stable and seems like a natural ally. Is that alliance like, a slam dunk, or I'm sure there's nuance to it, but.
Yeah, no, the question is about the U.S. relationship with the Kurds. Again, really complicated, where on the one hand, the Kurds want autonomy in terms of they want to control most of their oil revenues, they want to be able to preserve their own identity, etc. But the Kurds have thus far not actually wanted true independence. They have not wanted to yet set up Kurdistan. Rather, they want autonomy in a federated Iraqi government. So they still see themselves as Iraqi in a way. I'm not a native Texan, maybe somewhere here, but I live in Texas now. Kind of like how Texans like to be Texas but still be a part of the United States, right? So it's imperfect, but it's an interesting state. So there's a little bit of that analogy with the Kurds. And as of 2-3 years ago, it was kind of working for them pretty well. But then a number of troubling things have happened. One, as the Iraqi government in Baghdad became more and more Shia, more and more sectarian, more under Iran's sway, is where I do think the complete withdrawal of American troops was a big mistake. I think that led directly to the rise of the Islamic State. I think that has contributed to Iraq's being pulled into Iran's orbit. That has made the Kurds, who we forget are also Sunni, very anxious. And they feel like they used to have a lot more influence with Baghdad than they do. So as they feel like they had a social contract before, which was we have some autonomy and Baghdad still listens to us, and therefore we'll be a part of Iraq. Now they feel like Baghdad doesn't listen to them. The other big thing, of course, is the Islamic State, who has concentrated a lot of its aggression on the Kurds. And some of the famed Peshmerga militias did not do so well in some of the initial fighting against the Islamic State. So the Kurds are feeling alienated from Baghdad, distant from the United States, and under assault by the Islamic State. And again, that in the near term does not look promising. And then, of course, there's also a number of Kurds who live in Turkey. And one of the other implicit bargains had been that the Kurds in Iraq will not try to form independent Kurdistan by carving out a piece of Turkey, because then Turkey would go to war. And thus far that is held, but as all these other fissures are starting to fall apart, we may see that too. And again, that would not end well. All right, yeah.
I've got another question to ask you.
Professor McCoy.
So you made reference, which an analogy I've used to students as well, about we might not like a lot of governments we have to work with them. Great example being Saddam during World War II. Do you see Iran as the Saddam of today and ISIS as current Nazi Germany?
I've thought about that because I wanted to be open to it, but no. I'll just give you, unlike most professors who like to hedge, no, let's nuance that. We specialize in that. No, I don't. Why not? A few reasons. One, we don't need Iran to defeat the Islamic State. We've got plenty of other allies in the region who are ready and willing and already have been wanting to fight the Islamic State. And the U.S. have a very, very half-hearted commitment right now to fighting the Islamic State ourselves. So they could be defeated without using Iran. Second is, on balance, I'm still very skeptical of Iran's intentions throughout the region. If on balance I felt like, well, we may not agree with them on everything, but if we can work with them on this, and then they'll at least be moderately well behaved on other things. But they were killing hundreds, if not thousands, of American troops in Iraq up until a couple of years ago. They're still actively sponsoring Hezbollah. They still support Hamas. The whole tangle of pathologies that they're active with. I just don't see really good intentions coming out of Iran under this current regime. I also think that the Iranian people are potentially our best allies in this. I think most of the Iranian people, as we saw the Green Movement in 2009, would prefer to have a different government. They're very proud Persian patriots. They've got a wonderful civilizational inheritance. They're educated, they're sophisticated, they've got tremendous natural resources. They deserve a much better say in their future, and a much better, much better life. But I don't think that's going to happen under this current regime. And on balance, I just don't see them playing the helpful Stalin role they did in World War II. But I could be wrong. The Obama administration's making another bet on that, and it's not a completely implausible one. I think it's wrong, but it's not completely implausible. Rank.
So, talking about, I bought because I know you and like you.
Okay, watch out. Anytime a question starts that way, so it sounds like my wife. Honey, I love you. Okay, what did I do now? All right. Randy, by the way, is an old friend going back to graduate school days. So.
Your vision of an aspirational Christian foreign policy, but that doesn't seem to, for many people, that doesn't describe the actual way foreign policy functions, and it probably doesn't describe the way that I'm assuming. I guess I want to see you analyze this. The way the guy down the hall from you at the White House was thinking about foreign policy, which is maybe more about the exercise of power or business economic dominance. So how do we fit those, like the Will Inboden vision of an aspirational sort of build the house from the sort of natural sin that gets in the way of the way America actually functions, American foreign policy actually functions?
Yeah. Well, power.
You're not naive, but maybe that's one.
Oh, maybe I am naive. I know. No, I don't see a lot of dissimilarity, though. I mean, I think power is the basic currency of international politics. I mean, I think ideals and norms play into it as well, but I think at the end of the day, power is the basic currency of it. And so the question is, how can a structure be built that channels that power in constructive directions and mitigates the destructive or unsalubrious use of power? I think that when power and the structures are appropriately channeled, that also helps provide greater economic growth and prosperity for others too. So I generally have no problem with the role of economic factors in international politics either. I mean, I think that those are a number of the examples I tried to use there. So, I hope I can somewhat distinguish this from a much more cynical, purely Kissingerian, dark view of the world that order can only be maintained. There's no possibility of even approximate justice or anything like that. No, I just start with saying, no, we've got to start with preserving order, and then that creates the context for improvements in justice and liberty and prosperity and things like that. So I reject the premise of the question. I should have said at the beginning, right? Okay. Yes?
I just have a quick follow-up to that, because I was going to ask, could you, and I don't have a strong political science background, but could you differentiate order and justice? Like how does order, you referenced Niebuhr saying that order implicates justice, but how would you start with order without talking about justice?
Yeah, well, Niebuhr actually said order precedes justice too, so there's a sequencing there. So, that's actually a great question, because they sound like simple words, just roll on the tongue, but embedded in them, there's a lot of assumptions. I would start by distinguishing order from chaos, instability, things like that. So order is, it involves a set of rules, it involves predictability, it involves systems that function, like I said, just, the analogy being, order is people following the stoplights on the street. It may not mean that there's justice and human flourishing taking place in the cars, but it means car accidents are not happening, all right? Whereas justice, I think, is much more ennobling, much more aspirational. Justice is the realization of human flourishing. Justice is the absence of oppression. Justice is human dignity being fully respected and protected. Again, I know these are lofty concepts, but going back to the traffic analogy, justice is not just traffic accidents not happening, but everyone having an equal opportunity to have a car. Justice is people driving in the cars speaking kindly and truthfully to each other rather than tearing each other down or seeking predatory advantage, things like that. So, and so also thus in the international system. Okay. Oh, from you or?
One more question.
Okay. I can take another one, or you've got the one.
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
I'll ask it then.
Oh, right, okay. Our latter-day Niburian himself, so.
Given the increase in religious persecution around the world, and particularly the suffering of Christians around the world, two-part question. What explains the passivity of evangelicals in the United States toward this? Is it ignorance, or is it simply the intractability of it? That's part one. Part two is, if Obama were to ask you right now, hey, I've got these two offices of the Department of State, but we're not doing too well, what would you suggest to him and to our Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, as to things that we might want to commend to you to advance more religious freedom, but in particularly the protection of Christians who are suffering very severe oppression?
Okay, great question. I hope all of you heard it. So the first part of it is the apathy of American Christians towards the persecution of our brothers and sisters overseas. Is it from apathy or ignorance? Yes. I think it's from both. I'm not trying to be too glib there. I have, if I can be self-critical here for a moment, so in the 1990s when I was working in Capitol Hill, one of the projects I worked on was the drafting and mobilization and passage of what became the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. For those in the business, it was an important piece of human rights legislation. And what enabled that to happen was a number of factors, but a key one was the mobilization of evangelical Christians. It was international days of prayer being held in pulpits across the country for the persecuted church and for the passage of this legislation. It was the representatives of a lot of the different Christian groups in Washington quitting their squabbling, coming together and saying, we want to see this bill passed. And we are going to flood the Capitol Hill switchboard with thousands and thousands of calls on his behalf. And it was also, by the way, Christians understanding co-belligerence. What's that mean? It means sitting down with the Tibetan Buddhists and the Baha'is and the Jewish groups and the Catholics and other non-evangelical religious communities, saying we may not agree on soteriology, we may not agree on the Trinity, we may not even agree on what day of the week is the Holy Week, but we all agree on religious freedom. And we all agree that religious persecution overseas is a problem. And that was a very potent coalition, and it came together and it worked, and it got Congress to pass that bill, and it became law. And then what happened? Everyone went back to their pews and forgot about it. And this is what I mean about self-critical, is we evangelicals, I am happy and honored to identify as one. Historically, we have this sporadic, short attention spans. Sociologically, evangelicalism is this very activist movement, right? And so we get stirred up by moving stories that visitors from Texas tell you about going to churches in Saudi Arabia at 3 in the morning. But tomorrow, you're going to be back to classes and figuring out what your summer internships are going to be. And tomorrow, I'm going to be back to writing a talk on Reagan's foreign policy. Okay, and so that's partly the human condition, but something that I think the evangelical subculture is particularly susceptible to. We get mobilized, we get stirred up, we get this and this, we got to do something, and then it happens or it doesn't happen. Either way, we just forget about it. We go back. That's it. But I wouldn't be able to have a talk here without taking a shot at the media too. And the media wildly underreports this. How many of you in the last week have read a story in the so-called mainstream media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, LA Times, USA Today, what have you, about the horrific persecution of Christians going on around the world today? Okay, well there's one. I didn't, because they're not being printed. Every now and then they will be, but for the scale of the problem, the level of media coverage is appallingly low. And now that doesn't liberate American Christians from our responsibility to know what is going on around the world, but it does make it a little bit harder when you're not necessarily being slapped in the face with it. But then I also come back to this point earlier, to one of the themes of the talk, and this comes around to my advice for President Obama. And I've written this publicly. I don't think he reads my stuff, but if he does, he's got more important things to do than read the rantings of just a professor in Austin, Texas now. But we have the tools in the diplomatic toolkit. We have an ambassador at large at the State Department for International Religious Freedom. David Saperstein, good guy, friend of mine. He's doing a good job. He's largely ignored. We have the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We have annual reports on international religious freedom. We have a Congress that gets interested in these things. Those tools are not being used very well, but I think the larger story here is so much of the persecution of Christians is taking place against the backdrop of this breakdown of order, of the Islamic State going around doing these beheadings, of the Kim Jong-un regime in North Korea butchering Christians, horribly persecuting Christians, just as it horribly persecutes just about all of its other citizens as well. And so I think the actual more important steps to take to create conditions better for religious freedom and human flourishing for Christians is to defeat the Islamic State, is to support some sort of end to the Kim regime in North Korea. And I know that's a hand grenade to toss out there. It's, again, not a good option. It's the least bad option among others. It's to support some sort of path to some sort of representative government in China so that Xi Jinping does not somehow see house church Christians as the greatest threat to his rule. So sometimes the best way to alleviate Christian suffering is through some of these indirect channels of just helping to promote more representative, stable, prosperous, peaceful governments. It's not the palliative for everything. With the Saudis, I do think we can engage with them more directly on this. We do have a lot of leverage with them. But again, the Saudis will start listening to us on persecution of Christians if they feel like we start listening to them on Iran's nuclear program. So these things are embedded there. Not that I want to outsource our foreign policy to Riyadh, but in this case, I think they have a point. So,
All right, well, everybody, join me in thanking Dr. Isabel.